Although Australia was remote from the main battlefronts, there was considerable Axis naval activity in Australian waters during the Second World War. A total of 54 German and Japanese warships and submarines entered Australian waters between 1940 and 1945 and attacked ships, ports and other targets. Among the best-known attacks are the sinking of HMAS Sydney by a German raider in November 1941, the bombing of Darwin by Japanese naval aircraft in February 1942, and the Japanese Midget submarine attack on Sydney Harbour in May 1942. In addition, many Allied merchant ships were damaged or sunk off the Australian coast by submarines and mines. Japanese submarines also shelled several Australian ports, and submarine-based aircraft flew over several Australian capital cities. The Axis threat to Australia developed gradually and until 1942 was limited to sporadic attacks by German armed merchantmen. The level of Axis naval activity peaked in the first half of 1942 when Japanese submarines conducted anti-shipping patrols off Australia's coast, and Japanese naval aviation attacked several towns in northern Australia. The Japanese submarine offensive against Australia was renewed in the first half of 1943 but was broken off as the Allies pushed the Japanese on to the defensive. Few Axis naval vessels operated in Australian waters in 1944 and 1945, and those that did had only a limited impact, due to the episodic nature of the Axis attacks and the relatively small number of ships and submarines committed. Germany and Japan were not successful in disrupting Australian shipping, while the Allies were forced to deploy substantial assets to defend shipping in Australian waters. This did not have a significant impact on the Australian war effort or American-led operations in the Southwest Pacific area. Australia Station and Australian defences. The definition of Australian waters used throughout this article is, broadly speaking, the area which was designated the Australia Station prior to the outbreak of war. This vast area consisted of the waters around Australia and eastern New Guinea, and stretching south to Antarctica. From east to west, it stretched from 170 degrees east in the Pacific Ocean to 80 degrees east in the Indian Ocean, and from north to south it stretched from the equator to the Antarctic. While the eastern half of New Guinea was an Australian colonial possession during the Second World War and fell within the Australia Station, the Japanese operations in these waters formed part of the New Guinea and Solomon Islands campaigns and were not directed at Australia. The defence of the Australia Station was the Royal Australian Navy's main concern throughout the war. While RAN ships frequently served outside Australian waters, escort vessels and minesweepers were available to protect shipping in the Australia Station at all times. These escorts were supported by a small number of larger warships, such as cruisers and armed merchant cruisers, for protection against surface raiders. While important military shipping movements were escorted from the start of the war, convoys were not instituted in Australian waters until June 1942. The Australian naval authorities did, however, close ports for shipping at various times following rare suspected sightings of enemy warships or mines prior to June 1942. The Royal Australian Air Force was also responsible for the protection of shipping within the Australia Station. Throughout the war, RAF aircraft escorted convoys and conducted reconnaissance and anti-submarine patrols from bases around Australia. The main types of aircraft used for maritime patrol were Avro Ansons, Bristol Beauforts, Consolidated PBY Catalinas and Lockheed Hudsons. Following the outbreak of the Pacific War, RAF fighter squadrons were also stationed to protect key Australian ports and escorted restricted shipping in areas where air attack was feared. The Allied naval forces assigned to the Australia station were considerably increased following Japan's entry into the war and the beginning of the United States military build-up in Australia. These naval forces were supported by a large increase in the RAAF's Maritime Patrol Force and the arrival of United States Navy patrol aircraft. Following the initial Japanese submarine attacks, a convoy system was instituted between Australian ports, and by the end of the war the RAF and RAN had escorted over 1,100 convoys along the Australian coastline. As the battlefront moved to the north and attacks in Australian waters became less frequent, the number of ships and aircraft assigned to shipping protection duties within the Australia station was considerably reduced. In addition to the air and naval forces assigned to protect shipping in Australian waters, fixed defences were constructed to protect the major Australian ports. The Australian Army was responsible for developing and manning coastal defences to protect ports from attacks by enemy surface raiders. These defences commonly consisted of a number of fixed guns defended by anti-aircraft guns and infantry. The Army's coastal defences were considerably expanded as the threat to Australia increased between 1940 and 1942, and reached the peak strength in 1944. The Royal Australian Navy was responsible for developing and manning harbour defences in Australia's main ports. These defences consisted of fixed anti-submarine booms and mines supported by small patrol craft, and were also greatly expanded as the threat to Australia increased. The RAN also laid defensive minefields in Australian waters from August 1941, while the naval and air forces available for the protection of shipping in Australian waters were never adequate to defeat a heavier coordinated attack. They proved sufficient to mount defensive patrols against the sporadic and generally cautious attacks mounted by the Axis Navis during the war, 1939 to 1941. German surface raiders in 1940. While German surface raiders operated in the Western Indian Ocean in 1939 and early 1940, they did not enter Australian waters until the second half of 1940. The first Axis ships in Australian waters were the unarmed Italian ocean liners, Remo and Romolo, which were in Australian waters when Fascist Italy entered the war on the 11th of June 1940 Eastern Australian time. While Remo was docked at Fremantle and was easily captured, Romolo proved harder to catch, as she had left Brisbane on the 5th of June bound for Italy. Following an air and sea search, Romolo was intercepted by HMAS Manora near Nauru on the 12th of June and was scuttled by her captain to avoid capture. The German surface raider Orion was the first Axis warship to operate in Australian waters during World War II. After operating off the northern tip of New Zealand and the South Pacific, Orion entered Australian waters in the Coral Sea in August 1940 and closed to within 120 nmi northeast of Brisbane on the 11th of August. Following this, Orion headed east and operated off New Caledonia before proceeding south into the Tasman Sea, sinking the merchant ship Noto southwest of Noumea on the 16th of August and the British merchant ship Turakina in the Tasman Sea 4 days later. Orion sailed southwest after sinking Turakina, passing south of Tasmania, and operated without success in the Great Australian Bight in early September, while Orion laid 4 dummy mines off Albany, Western Australia on the 2nd of September. She departed to the southwest after being spotted by an Australian aircraft the next day. After unsuccessfully patrolling in the Southern Ocean, Orion sailed for the Marshall Islands to refuel, arriving there on the 10th of October. Penguin was the next raider to enter Australian waters. Penguin entered the Indian Ocean from the South Atlantic in August 1940 and arrived off Western Australia in October. Penguin captured the 8,998 long tons Norwegian tanker Storstad off Northwest Cape on the 7th of October and proceeded east with the captured ship. Penguin laid mines between Sydney and Newcastle on the 28th of October, and Storstad laid mines off the Victorian coast on the nights of 29 to 31 October. Penguin also laid further mines off Adelaide in early November. The two ships then sailed west for the Indian Ocean. Penguin and Storstad were not detected during their operations off Australia's eastern and southern coasts, and succeeded in sinking 3 ships. Mines laid by Storstad sank 2 ships off Wilson's Promontory in early November, and the mines laid off Sydney by Penguin sank 1 ship, and a further merchant ship was damaged after striking a mine off Adelaide. Penguin added to her tally of successes in Australian waters by sinking 3 merchant ships in the Indian Ocean during November. On the 7th of December 1940, the German raiders Orion and Comet arrived off the Australian protectorate of Nauru. During the next 48 hours, the 2 ships sank 4 merchant ships off the undefended island. Heavily loaded with survivors from the victims, the raiders departed for Emirau Island, where they unloaded the prisoners. After an unsuccessful attempt to lay mines off Rabaul on the 24th of December, Comet made a second attack on Nauru on the 27th of December and shelled the island's phosphate plant and dock facilities. This attack was the last Axis naval attack in Australian waters until November 1941. Consequences of the raid on Nauru led to serious concern about the supply of phosphates from their and nearby Ocean Island. Though the general situation with naval forces allowed only limited response to threats to the isolated islands, there was some redeployment of warships and a proposal to deploy 6-inch naval guns to the islands despite provisions of the mandate prohibiting fortification, but a shortage of such guns resulted in a change to a proposed 2 field guns for each island. The most serious effect of the raid was the fall in phosphate output in 1941, though decisions as early as 1938 to increase stockpiles of raw rock in Australia mitigated that decline. Another consequence was the institution of the first trans-Tasman commercial convoys, with Convoy VK1 composed of Empire Star, Port Chalmers, Empress of Russia, and Maunganui, leaving Sydney the 30th of December 1940 for Auckland, escorted by HMNZS Achilles. Following the raids on Nauru, Comet and Orion sailed for the Indian Ocean, passing through the Southern Ocean well to the south of Australia in February and March 1941 respectively. Comet re-entered the Australia station in April en route to New Zealand, and Atlantis sailed east through the southern extreme of the Australia station in August. Until November, the only casualties from Axis ships on the Australia station were caused by mines laid by Penguin in 1940. The small trawler Millamummel was sunk, with the loss of 7 lives after striking a mine off the New South Wales coast on the 26th of March 1941, and 2 ratings from a rendering mines safe party were killed while attempting to defuse a mine which had washed ashore in South Australia on 14 July. On the 19th of November 1941, the Australian light cruiser HMAS Sydney, which had been highly successful in the Battle of the Mediterranean, encountered the disguised German raider Cormoran. approximately 150 miles southwest of Carnarvon, Western Australia. Sydney intercepted Cormoran and demanded that she prove her assumed identity as the Dutch freighter Straat Malacca. During the interception, Sydney's captain brought his ship dangerously close to Cormoran. As a result, when Cormoran was unable to prove her identity and avoid a battle she had little hope of surviving, the raider was able to use all her weaponry against Sydney. In the resulting battle, Cormoran and Sydney were both crippled, with Sydney sinking with the loss of all her 645 crew and 78 of Cormoran's crew being either killed in the battle or dying before they could be rescued by passing ships. Cormoran was the only Axis ship to conduct attacks in Australian waters during 1941 and the last Axis surface raider to enter Australian waters. Until 1943, there is no evidence to support claims that a Japanese submarine participated in the sinking of HMAS Sydney. The only German ship to enter the Australia station during 1942 was the blockade runner and supply ship Ramses, which was sunk by HMAS Adelaide and HNLMS Jacob van Heemskerk on 26 November, shortly after Ramses left Batavia bound for France. All of Ramses' crew survived the sinking and were taken prisoner. 1942. The naval threat to Australia increased dramatically following the outbreak of war in the Pacific. During the first half of 1942, the Japanese mounted a sustained campaign in Australian waters, with Japanese submarines attacking shipping and aircraft carriers conducting a devastating attack on the strategic port of Darwin. In response to these attacks, the Allies increased the resources allocated to protecting shipping in Australian waters. Early Japanese submarine patrols. The first Japanese submarines to enter Australian waters were I-121, I-122, I-123 and I-124, from the Imperial Japanese Navy's Submarine Squadron 6. Acting in support of the Japanese offensive in the Netherlands East Indies. These boats laid minefields in the approaches to Darwin and the Torres Strait between 12 and 18 January 1942. These mines did not sink or damage any Allied ships. After completing the mine-laying missions, the 4 Japanese boats took station off Darwin to provide the Japanese fleet with warning of Allied naval movements. On 20 January 1942, the Australian Bathurst-class corvettes HMAS Deloraine, Katoomba and Lithgow sank I-124 near Darwin. This was the only full-sized submarine sunk by the Royal Australian Navy in Australian waters during World War II, being the first accessible ocean-going IJN submarine lost after Pearl Harbor. U.S. divers attempted to enter I-124 in order to obtain its code books, but were unsuccessful. Following the conquest of the Western Pacific, the Japanese mounted a number of reconnaissance patrols into Australian waters. 3 submarines operated off Western Australia in March 1942, sinking the merchant ships Paragy and Siantar on 1 and 3 March respectively. In addition, I-25 conducted a reconnaissance patrol down the Australian east coast in February and March. During this patrol, Nobuo Fujita from the I-25 flew a Yokosuka E-14Y1 float plane over Sydney, Melbourne and Hobart. Following these reconnaissances, I-25 sailed for New Zealand and conducted overflights of Wellington and Auckland on 8 March and 13 March respectively. Japanese naval aviation attacks. The bombing of Darwin on 19 February 1942 was the heaviest single attack mounted by the Imperial Japanese Navy against mainland Australia. On the 19th of February, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers launched a total of 188 aircraft from a position in the Timor Sea. The 4 carriers were escorted by 4 cruisers and 9 destroyers. These 188 naval aircraft inflicted heavy damage on Darwin and sank 9 ships. A raid conducted by 54 land-based bombers later the same day resulted in further damage to the town and RAF-based Darwin and the destruction of 20 Allied military aircraft. Allied casualties were 236 killed and between 300 and 400 wounded, the majority of whom were non-Australian Allied sailors. Only 4 Japanese aircraft were confirmed to have been destroyed by Darwin's defenders. The bombing of Darwin was the first of many Japanese naval aviation attacks against targets in Australia. The carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, which escorted the invasion force dispatched against Port Moresby in May 1942, had the secondary role of attacking Allied bases. In northern Queensland, once Port Moresby was secured, these attacks did not occur, however, as the landings at Port Moresby were cancelled when the Japanese carrier force was mauled in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese aircraft made almost 100 raids, most of them small, against northern Australia during 1942 and 1943. Land-based IJN aircraft took part in many of the 63 raids on Darwin which took place after the initial attack. The town of Broome, Western Australia experienced a devastating attack by IJN fighter planes on 3 March 1942, in which at least 88 people were killed. Long-range seaplanes operating from bases in the Solomon Islands made a number of small attacks on towns in Queensland. Japanese naval aircraft operating from land bases also harassed coastal shipping in Australia's northern waters during 1942 and 1943. On 15 December, 1942, 4 sailors were killed when the merchant ship Period was attacked off Cape Wessel. The small general-purpose vessel HMAS Patricia Cam was sunk by a Japanese floatplane near the Wessel Islands on the 22nd of January 1943 with the loss of 9 sailors and civilians. Another civilian sailor was killed when the merchant ship Islander was attacked by a floatplane during May 1943. Attacks on Sydney and Newcastle in March 1942. The Japanese military adopted a strategy of isolating Australia from the United States by capturing Port Moresby in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Samoa and New Caledonia. This plan was frustrated by the Japanese defeat in the Battle of the Coral Sea and was postponed indefinitely after the Battle of Midway. Following the defeat of the Japanese surface fleet, the IJN submarines were deployed to disrupt Allied supply lines by attacking shipping off the Australian east coast. On 27 April 1942, the submarines I-21 and I-29 left the major Japanese naval base at Truk Lagoon in the Japanese territory of the Caroline Islands to conduct reconnaissance patrols of Allied ports in the South Pacific. The goal of these patrols was to find a suitable target for the force of midget submarines, designated the Eastern Detachment of the 2nd Special Attack Flotilla, which was available in the Pacific. I-29 entered Australian waters in May and made an unsuccessful attack on the neutral Soviet freighter Welin off Newcastle on 16 May. I-29's floatplane overflew Sydney on 23 May 1942, finding a large number of major Allied warships in Sydney Harbour. I-21 reconnoitred Suva, Fiji and Auckland, New Zealand in late May but did not find worthwhile concentrations of shipping in either port. On the 18th of May, the eastern detachment of the 2nd Special Attack Flotilla left Truk Lagoon under the command of Captain Hank U. Sasaki. Sasaki's force comprised I-22, I-24 and I-27. Each submarine was carrying a midget submarine. After the intelligence gathered by I-21 and I-29 was assessed, the three submarines were ordered on the 24th of May to attack Sydney. The three submarines of the Eastern Detachment rendezvoused with I-21 and I-29 35 miles off Sydney on the 29th of May. In the early hours of the 30th of May, I-21's float plane conducted a reconnaissance flight over Sydney Harbour that confirmed the concentration of Allied shipping cited by I-29's float plane was still present and was a worthwhile target for a midget submarine raid. On the night of the 31st of May, 3 midget submarines were launched from the Japanese force outside the Sydney Heads. Although 2 of the submarines successfully penetrated the incomplete Sydney Harbour defences, only Midget A actually attacked Allied shipping in the harbour, firing 2 torpedoes at the American heavy cruiser US Chicago. These torpedoes missed Chicago but sank the depot ship HMAS Cuttable, killing 21 seamen on board, and seriously damaged the Dutch submarine KIX. All of the Japanese midget submarines were lost during this operation. Following this raid, the Japanese submarine force operated off Sydney and Newcastle, sinking the Coast Ryan Chieftain off Sydney on the 3rd of June. On the night of the 8th of June, I-24 conducted a bombardment of the eastern suburbs of Sydney and I-21 bombarded Newcastle. Fort Scratchley at Newcastle returned fire, but did not hit I-21. While these bombardments did not cause any casualties or serious damage, the bombardments generated concern over further attacks against the East Coast. Following the attacks on shipping in the Sydney region, the Royal Australian Navy instituted convoys between Brisbane and Adelaide. All ships of over 1,200 long tons and with speeds of less than 12 knots were required to sail in convoy when travelling between cities on the east coast. The Japanese submarine force left Australian waters in late June 1942, having sunk a further 2 merchant ships. The small number of sinkings achieved by the 5 Japanese submarines sent against the Australian east coast in May and June did not justify the commitment of so many submarines. Further Japanese submarine patrols. The Australian authorities enjoyed only a brief break in the submarine threat. In July 1942, a division of 3 submarines from Japanese Submarine Squadron 3 commenced operations off the east coast. These 3 submarines sank 5 ships and damaged several others during July and August. In addition, I-32 conducted a patrol off the southern coast of Australia while en route from New Caledonia to Penang, though the submarine was not successful in sinking any ships in this area. Following the withdrawal of this force in August, no further submarine attacks were mounted against Australia until January 1943. While Japanese submarines sank 17 ships in Australian waters in 1942, the submarine offensive did not have a serious impact on the Allied war effort in the Southwest Pacific or the Australian economy. Nevertheless, by forcing ships sailing along the east coast to travel in convoy, the Japanese submarines were successful in reducing the efficiency of Australian coastal shipping. This lower efficiency translated into between 7.5% and 22% less tonnage being transported between Australian ports each month. These convoys were effective, however, with no ship travelling as part of a convoy being sunk in Australian waters during 1942.